Good afternoon, or good morning, or whatever makes sense. I'm back, but I'm taking a break from environmental remediation, if nothing else, because you've noticed it apparently takes me about a month to finally edit and post a video on that topic. So I'm going to do a little shorter video on a little different topic, and that is an engineering disaster, but sort of a small, local engineering disaster. We're going to talk about the Raton Pass Skyride, New Mexico's lesser known tourist aerial lift. Now, aerial lifts are maybe a bit of a point of pride here in the Albuquerque area because we have the Sandia Peak Tramway, an aerial tramway which is the longest in North America and was at one point the longest in the world, although I think it lost that title about a decade ago. We're going to talk about something which is quite a bit smaller and which is more of a gondola lift instead. That sort of requires, of course, going on a little bit of a diversion about terminology. We have a bit of an issue here in the United States with the terms that we use to refer to aerial lifts. We tend to call them either tramways or cable cars. This is confusing because both of those terms also refer to other things, and I believe in Europe, predominantly refer to things other than aerial lifts. So I'm going to at least do my best to stick to aerial lift as a generic term, and to specifically talk about aerial tramways and gondola lifts, and those are terms that do have a bit of a difference between them. An aerial tramway is more of a train type device. There's usually a smaller number of carriers. They run along support ropes, which are fixed, and they are propelled by a haul rope, not unlike a cable car. A gondola lift, on the other hand, instead of a small number of usually enclosed carriers, has a large number of usually but not always non-enclosed carriers, which are suspended from and driven by the same rope, so there's one moving rope. Now that's a bit of a generalization, but it's not always true, and in fact we are here going to be talking about an exception. So let's take a look at the Raton Pass. For those of you who are not familiar with this area, the Raton Pass is a not too high but fairly rugged mountain pass, roughly between Raton, New Mexico, and Trinidad, Colorado. On this map, it's right here. Present-day Interstate 25 travels through the Raton Pass, making it the predominant path of travel from New Mexico to Colorado. So if you drive, for example, from Albuquerque to Denver or vice versa, you're going to be going through the Raton Pass. It's long been an important transportation point. A railroad was built around the turn of the century, and by the end of the 1920s, U.S. Highway 85 had been put through the Raton Pass, although its alignment has changed a couple of times. U.S. Highway 85, of course, was eventually replaced by Interstate 25, but our story starts in the early 1950s. In addition to its strategic importance for transportation, the Raton Pass is also a very scenic part of the state. It's up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, it's more wooded, it's a very pretty area, and having Highway 85 coming through as kind of the main path of travel south from Denver also made it a fairly prominent tourist attraction. So despite the pass only being about 7,800 feet, not especially high, it's particularly rugged and interesting terrain, it's a choke point, and it's a very attractive spot for a roadside stop. In fact, in the early 1950s, an individual named Jim Elliott owned exactly that. He owned a service station and a restaurant right in the center of the Raton Pass, almost exactly on the Colorado-New Mexico border. And he decided to expand his tourist operations somewhat by constructing a tourist aerial skyride. So let's take a look at Jim Elliott's roadside stop. In this 1947 aerial from USGS, it's not especially easy to see, but this building, I believe, is the service station and restaurant owned by Jim Elliott. It did end up moving when the freeway was put through, so it's a little hard to track down the details exactly. But this is Highway 85 passing through here. And to the east, there is a large mesa. This mesa has a pretty commanding view over the entire Raton Pass area. It's a fairly good distance above the roadway, and I suppose Jim Elliott thought that it would be a great spot for a viewpoint accessed by a gondola lift. Jim Elliott partnered with DeRuin Machine Works of Trinidad, Colorado on the design and construction of the Raton Pass Skyride. This was likely his first mistake. DeRuin Machine Works, it's hard to track down a lot of information about them today. Doesn't seem to have been a going concern for some time, but it's pretty clear that they did not have much experience in the area of aerial lifts, which aerial lifts in particular are an industry that's sort of infamous for being dominated by just a few companies, mostly out of Switzerland. It's a fairly specialized field. DeRuin, though, is not working from experience. They were trying to figure this out from the first time. In fact, one of the few things I could find about DeRuin is that they held a patent on a device for measuring tree rings, and they appear to have sold that by mail order as well. So, tree ring measurement to a gondola lift is, well, it's a pretty big jump, and I think that was the beginning of the troubles with the Raton Pass Skyride. In this 1954 aerial image, it's hard to make out, but the Skyride should actually now be here. I'll point it out to you. I'm not sure that you can really see it at all in this aerial image, but that red line should show about its path, with the top station here on the edge of the mesa, and the lower station down closer to the highway. I don't think buildings had been constructed at the top or bottom at this point, which makes it a little bit more difficult to pick out. Now, there are anecdotal reports that there was trouble with the Skyride from the very beginning. One person on the internet said that it was initially constructed with too few towers spaced too far apart, which required sort of adding additional kind of strange towers later on. We'll see that a little bit later when we kind of look at an analysis of the incident. But it seems like the Skyride had safety problems from the very beginning. Including reports that drive failures were just an issue that the operators of the ride contended with on a regular basis for the whole time it was operating. While the Skyride did initially receive some positive reporting in the newspapers, we saw an example of that right up front, most of the press attention it got was decidedly negative. The Skyride's first big moment in the spotlight came in 1957, when a set of two Boy Scouts riding the Skyride fell on their carrier about 40 feet to the ground. So what exactly happened here? Well, the Raton Pass Skyride consisted of two-person bench seats suspended from the cable. It sounds a little bizarre that one of them would have just fallen off. The way most modern gondola lifts are designed, it's very difficult for that to happen unless there's a full deropement. Back in the mid-50s, and back with DeRuin Machine Works, though, things were being done a little bit differently. The Raton Pass Skyride actually employed a separate support rope and haul rope. So the carriers were suspended from the support rope and then pulled uphill or pulled downhill by the haul rope. It seems what happened here is that the carrier simply fell off of the support rope, and then there wasn't enough tension in the haul rope to stop the carrier from just hitting the ground. Both of the boys involved in this incident were injured. Their parents ended up filing a lawsuit for $250,000. That lawsuit settled out of court, and the terms weren't disclosed, but it certainly brought to light the broader issue of safety with the Skyride, and I'll say in addition, safety with gondola lifts in general. An interesting issue with gondola lifts and aerial lifts is that in quite a few states, they're very minimally regulated or overseen by any safety authority. Here in New Mexico, all we really have in state statute is a requirement that operators of aerial lifts have a liability insurance policy, and that once a year they report to RLD the date of the most recent inspection. It seems like that's intended to require an inspection annually, but oddly, the statute which requires reporting the date of the inspection annually actually says nothing about how recently the inspection was required to have been done. I tried to see if there were additional RLD regulations requiring annual inspections, but I couldn't find anything. That said, we have a somewhat unusual situation here in New Mexico. It might be that one of the reasons that there's very little state oversight of aerial lifts is because virtually every aerial lift in the state of New Mexico exists on land leased from the Forest Service. And it turns out that as a matter of policy, when the Forest Service leases land to ski operations, they require, as a term of the lease, that any aerial lifts be operated to SAE standards, or B77 standards, which are industry standards for the safety of the design, operation, maintenance, inspections, etc. of aerial lifts. So, most aerial lifts in New Mexico are subject to design requirements and inspections as a result of Forest Service policy, if not state law or regulation. Of course, that doesn't help us a whole lot with the Raton Pass Skyride, both because we're talking about the mid-century when very few of these regulations existed, and because the Raton Pass Skyride was on private land owned by Jim Elliott, not on a Forest Service lease, so even as things are today, it would be almost entirely unregulated. At some point during the 1950s, Jim Elliott formed the Raton Pass Incorporation to own and operate the Skyride as well as the service station and restaurant. And at some point, ownership of the Raton Pass Incorporation transferred to an individual named Oscar Danielson, although I had a hard time tracking down exactly when that happened. In any case, the 60s brought a lot of changes to the Skyride because Highway 85 was replaced through the Raton Pass by Interstate 25. This photo, which is not at all 1947, but actually 1969, depicts the Raton Pass area as it was after construction of the freeway. You can see that the original Jim Elliott service station is gone, and it has been replaced by a set of structures over on the east side of the freeway. And that same spot exists today, although it's been somewhat expanded to add an RV park behind the service station. This is also the scene almost exactly as it looked for the second incident involving the Raton Pass Skyride. Despite the $250,000 lawsuit, the Skyride continued to operate after the 1957 incident until almost exactly 11 years later, in June of 1968, when there was yet a second incident. Now, this is only the second incident that I can find evidence of. There are anecdotal reports that there were other injuries involving the Skyride. I wasn't able to track down any newspaper reporting of them, so this is at least the second and the final time it had an issue, but quite possibly there were more than that. On June 15, 1968, the newlywed Guillaumes arrived at the Raton Pass Skyride on their honeymoon. They'd actually just been married the previous day. Along with the Guillaumes was a high school drill team there with their bus driver, who I'm assuming were on the way to or from some event and had decided to stop by the Skyride on their way to take in the view from the mesa. As a result of carriers that fell off of the support rope, particularly over the rocky and rugged area running up the hill to the mesa, and carriers which were tossed off the line entirely, predominantly at the lower station, as a result of quickly running backwards. One person, newlywed Robert Guillaume, died. At least 5 others were injured, including the bus driver and members of the high school drill team. Depending on the newspaper, as many as 17 people were injured, at least 5 were hospitalized, several of them were kept in critical condition. And this incident in 1968 finally spelled the end for the Raton Pass Skyride. There was a lawsuit filed, actually the surprisingly small dollar amount, under $100,000. I suspect there were others. I'm also not sure how that lawsuit was resolved, but in any case, the Skyride never opened. The owner reported to newspapers that they were waiting on an insurance investigation to be completed, and then the trail really goes cold. The Skyride was abandoned in place and never really spoken of again, although one person mentions that the family that had owned the Skyride actually left town as a result of the scandal. Today, the site of the Raton Pass Skyride exists more or less as it did in 1968 on the east side of the freeway, right on the border between Colorado and New Mexico. Where the Raton Pass travel stop and restaurant were located, there is still a roadside stop and restaurant today, with the addition of an RV park just behind it to the east. And if we look a little bit to the north, we can actually see the roof of the original ticket booth for the Skyride. The lower terminal and the lower towers seem to have been removed, but looking towards the ridge of the mesa, it appears that the upper towers of the Skyride are still there. It's hard to make out when you're going by on the freeway, but it seems that they are indeed. And the top of the mesa, where the Skyride used to end, is now used as a radio site with several different towers, but the upper terminal of the Skyride actually appears to still be intact as well. Unfortunately, this is private property, but seems the Skyride wasn't entirely removed, and there is still something to remember it by. So that's a brief story about a bit of local New Mexico engineering history. If there's a lesson to be learned here, it's probably that if you're looking to install an aerial tram or a gondola lift, it's probably a good idea to go with a vendor that has actually done that before, or at least knows something about the topic. Several clear mistakes seem to have been made in the design of the Skyride, and a number of people suffered for it, one fatally. That seems to have been somewhat typical of the tourist gondola lifts of the mid-century, and I might make a few more videos on these because I do always enjoy aerial lifts, and certainly there was a period of time when they were quite haphazard. So next time you drive Interstate 25 through the Raton Pass, pour one out for the Raton Pass Skyride. This is the part of the video where I tell you to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. I hope we've gotten that over with now. And keep an eye out for my next video. Should be back on the environmental remediation topic.